The breathing in the dark. Part 1. Strange signs. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the house she had just moved into. Even though a few days had passed, the strange feelings and unease had not lessened, but instead, they grew stronger with each passing night. It all started on the first evening when she heard the breathing in the dark. The breathing wasn't human. It was a low, eerie sound, continuous and unsettling, as if something was hiding in the shadows behind her. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just the wind, but it didn't stop. In fact, it became clearer and louder as the night grew deeper. That evening, as Sarah was preparing for bed, a sudden cold gust of wind blew through the cracks in the old window, causing the doors in the house to creak. She pulled the blanket over her, trying to shake off the chill in her bones. But as she lay down, the breathing came again, this time closer than ever before. Her heart pounded, and each breath she took seemed to get caught in her throat, as if she couldn't breathe. She sat up suddenly, the light in her room flickering and the darkness enveloped everything. Sarah crept out of bed and moved toward the corner of the room, where the dim light of the night lamp cast its faint glow. But there was nothing there. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and stepped out into the hallway. All the doors were wide open, although she was sure she had closed them before going to bed. Part 2. The old house. The next day, while unpacking, Sarah happened upon an old journal tucked away in the corner of the bedroom. The journal belonged to one of the former members of the Winters family, the previous owners of the house. The pages were filled with strange symbols and cryptic writing, but what terrified Sarah the most was a particular line she read. "They have come. They will never leave. And if we do nothing, they will take us." Her heart raced, and she couldn't stop thinking about the words. The strange writing in the journal seemed to warn her of a lurking danger. Fear and curiosity mingled within her, making it impossible to set the journal aside, yet she couldn't fully understand what was written inside. Meanwhile, every night, the breathing grew clearer, more distinct, as though someone was quietly watching her, silently getting closer. One night, Sarah woke up in the middle of the night, and when she opened her eyes, she saw the faint light from the night lamp casting a shadow of a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. Her heart pounded in her chest, but when she blinked, the shadow was gone. Part 3. Strange figures. One night, as Sarah sat reading in the living room, she suddenly heard a soft, giggling laugh, like something ancient and distant. She quickly turned to the door, but there was no one there. However, when she looked back at the mirror on the wall, she saw a faint silhouette reflected behind her. She turned around instantly, but the room was empty. As time passed, the strange occurrences grew more terrifying. There were nights when she would wake up in the middle of the night and see glowing eyes staring at her from the shadows. Once, when she went into the bathroom, she found a smear of a handprint on the mirror, even though she was certain she had cleaned it that morning. One evening, as Sarah walked down the hallway, she suddenly heard a strange noise coming from inside the walls. It sounded like someone was tapping on the walls, the sound growing louder and louder, as if trying to break through the old plaster. She couldn't help but turn back, but when she looked, the wall was just a lifeless surface. As she stood there, an icy chill ran down her spine. Something was moving behind the walls, breathing. Part 4. Bloody Deaths. That evening, while researching more about the Winters family, Sarah came across a chilling article in the local newspaper. The Winters family was murdered one cold winter night, the cause of death unknown. There were no signs of forced entry, but all family members were slaughtered brutally, their bodies unrecognizable. She was stunned, unable to believe what she was reading. As she dug deeper, she found rumors that the Winters family had performed strange rituals and had opened a door to another world. This could explain the eerie sounds and the terrifying presence in the house. She began to feel drawn into a vortex of unexplainable mysteries. One day, while exploring the old storage room, Sarah found a small wooden box. Inside, there was a ceremonial robe, half-burned black candles, and an old leather-bound book containing forgotten rituals. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that these rituals might have been meant to release the trapped spirits in the house. Or perhaps they were the key to opening a portal for monsters from another realm to enter. But as she read the book, one line caught her eye. Once the door is opened, there is no closing it. Part 5, the final night. Sarah decided to perform the ritual described in the book, hoping to put an end to the strange occurrences. That night, when the moon was high, she gathered all the necessary items: black candles, powdered herbs, and the strange symbols the book instructed her to use. She set up the ritual in the center of the living room, placing the black candles around her and lighting them one by one. As she recited the incantation from the book, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air became thick, as if it were suffocating her. Shadows began to creep along the walls, and the breathing, that low, guttural sound, filled the room, now loud and insistent. The darkness seemed to coil around her, pulling her toward the center of the circle she had drawn with chalk. Suddenly, the house seemed to groan and tremble as if it were alive. The breathing grew louder, and then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, skeletal, its skin a pale, waxy gray, with eyes that glowed a fiery red. Its mouth open wide, and the breath that escaped it was like the hiss of a dying animal. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt her body freeze, unable to move. The figure took a step toward her, its long, bony fingers reaching for her. The house around her seemed to meld away, as though she were being pulled into another realm. The breathing intensified, louder and louder, until it was all she could hear. When she finally managed to break free of the paralysis, she tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The dark figure loomed closer, its red eyes burning into her soul. Part 6, the final reveal. Just as the figure was about to touch her, the room shattered into darkness. A deafening silence followed, and when Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of the living room, alone. But the room had changed. The walls were cracked, the air thick with the stench of decay. The candles had burned out, leaving only black smoke in their wake. As Sarah tried to stand, she noticed something horrifying. The journal, the ritual book, the robe, everything she had used to perform the ritual had vanished. She felt as though she had just awoken from a nightmare, but the gnawing sense of dread told her it was far from over. The shadows had deepened, and the oppressive weight of the house pressed down on her chest. Suddenly, she heard again the breathing. It was closer this time, unmistakable, as if it were in the room with her. Slowly, she turned her head and saw a shape in the corner of the room, watching her. Its eyes glowed, burning with malice. The figure that had haunted her dreams had returned. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. In that moment, Sarah understood. The ritual hadn't closed the door, it had opened it even wider. The spirits that had been trapped in the house were now free, and they would never leave. And worse yet, Sarah realized they had claimed her. The house, still standing on the hill, remains abandoned, a monument to the horrors that occurred within. Those brave enough to approach speak of strange whispers, of cold winds that sweep through the house even on the hottest of days. The breathing, the low, horrible sound, can still be heard, echoing in the walls. Some say that Sarah's fate was sealed the moment she performed that final ritual, and others, who venture too close at night, claim to have seen her wandering the halls, her face pale and twisted, her eyes wide with terror, forever trapped in the very place that had destroyed her. The house waits, the shadows linger, and the breathing, it never stops. The cursed room. The old mansion at the end of Blackwood Street had always been the subject of fearful whispers among the town's residents. Once a grand estate belonging to the Holloway family, it now stood abandoned, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the abyss of the forest behind it. For decades, Rumors swirled about the house's sinister past. Some spoke of the strange disappearance of the entire Holloway family on a stormy night in 1923. Others told of blood-curdling screams that echoed from within its walls when the moon was at its highest. But the most terrifying tale of all was about the cursed room on the mansion's third floor, a room where no one who entered ever returned. Eager to prove himself and desperate for a place to stay, a young journalist named Daniel Whitmore decided to spend a night in the mansion. He was an ambitious man, drawn to the supernatural not by belief, but by the thrill of debunking myths. His latest assignment was to write a feature on local ghost stories, and what better way to make headlines than by surviving a night in the town's most haunted house. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, Daniel pushed open the rusted iron gates and stepped onto the overgrown pathway. The mansion loomed before him, its wooden facade weathered and rotting. A sense of unease settled over him, but he brushed it aside. Inside, dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight. The air smelled of mildew and decay. Furniture, draped in white sheets, gave the impression of ghosts lurking in the corners. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps, as if whispering a warning. Ignoring the unease creeping up his spine, Daniel explored the lower floors, taking notes and snapping photos. He found nothing but broken furniture, torn wallpaper, and remnants of a life long abandoned. But then he found the staircase leading to the third floor. The moment his foot touched the first step, the air grew heavy. It was as if the house itself was aware of his intentions. The deeper he ascended, the more intense the feeling became. By the time he reached the top, he was struggling to breathe. Before him stood the cursed room. The door was different from the others, blackened with age, its knob an ornate silver that gleamed despite the dust coating everything else. Something inside him screamed to turn back, but he steeled himself. This was just an old house. There were no such things as curses. With a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was surprisingly well preserved. A grand four-poster bed sat in the center, its crimson canopy untouched by time. An old dresser stood against the wall, its mirror cracked but still intact. A heavy wooden wardrobe loomed in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. The air was thick with a metallic scent, something sharp and unpleasant. Daniel set up his camera and took a few pictures. He noted that the temperature inside was significantly colder than the rest of the house. He placed a hand on the bed's frame and recoiled immediately. It was ice cold, as if it had been left outside in the dead of winter. Then his camera flickered. He frowned and checked the battery. Fully charged. He adjusted the settings, but the screen continued to glitch. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and his breath became visible. A low creak echoed through the room. Slowly, he turned towards the wardrobe. It was open wider than before. A shadow moved inside. A chill ran down his spine as he lifted his flashlight, its beam trembling in his grasp. Something was in there, something watching him. Then, before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. A whisper, low and guttural, slithered through the air. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel spun around, his breath ragged. The wardrobe creaked open wider, revealing an abyss of darkness within. Then long, skeletal fingers, dripping with something black and viscous, emerged from the shadows. He stumbled back, his camera slipping from his grip. The screen flickered violently before displaying an image that made his stomach drop. His own face, distorted in agony, his eyes wide with unspeakable terror. A scream, inhuman, shrill, and filled with rage, pierced the air. The walls began to pulsate, as if the house itself was alive. The cracked mirror on the dresser reflected movement that wasn't his. A grotesque figure, its face a twisted, melted imitation of humanity, stood behind him. Daniel tried to run, but the air thickened like molasses. His limbs felt like lead. The whispers grew louder, turning into wails, and then laughter, mocking, cruel laughter that echoed from all directions. The bed's crimson canopy began to move, as if something unseen was beneath it. Suddenly, a rotting hand shot out, gripping his ankle with an inhuman strength. Daniel screamed, thrashing against the grip, but the more he fought, the deeper he was pulled into the floor. The camera, still recording, captured his final moments, his fingers clawing at the wooden planks, his face twisted in sheer horror before he was dragged into the darkness. And then silence. The next morning, when a search party arrived, the cursed room was empty. Daniel Whitmore was never seen again. The only evidence of his presence was his camera, lying on the floor, its last captured image a blurry, twisted reflection in the cracked mirror. A reflection that didn't belong to him. And the wardrobe door, now shut tight, dripped with fresh blood. Months later, another journalist, curious about Daniel's disappearance, decided to investigate. He too entered the mansion, determined to uncover the truth. He never came out. The townsfolk knew better than to search. The Holloway mansion stood, forever waiting, its cursed room hungering for its next visitor. Some nights, if you stand outside, you can hear the faint sound of whispers and the echo of a scream that never truly ends. The Faceless Man, Chapter 1, the first sighting. It started with a whisper. In the small, desolate town of Black Hollow, strange occurrences had always been a part of life. Stories of ghosts, demons, and other unexplainable horrors filled the local folklore, but none were as feared as the legend of the Faceless Man. They said he had no eyes, no mouth, and no nose, just smooth, pale skin stretched where his features should have been. No one knew where he came from, and no one who had seen him up close lived to tell the tale. 24-year-old Daniel Carter had never been one to believe in ghost stories. A skeptic at heart, he had grown up scoffing at the idea of spirits and monsters. That changed the night he first saw the Faceless Man. It was a cold autumn evening when Daniel took a shortcut through the woods behind his apartment. The town streetlights barely reached the twisted, gnarled trees that loomed over the narrow path. The only sounds were the distant hoots of owls and the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots. Then the air turned deathly still. A whisper, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, brushed past his ear. Daniel froze. The whisper had no discernible words, just an eerie hush that seemed to curl around him like a living thing. He turned sharply, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but saw nothing behind him. Yet, he felt something watching. Shoving his hands into his pockets, Daniel quickened his pace. The sooner he got home, the better. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the path, half hidden behind a tree. Tall, thin, completely motionless, and faceless. A chill shot down Daniel's spine. He blinked, and in that fraction of a second, the figure vanished. His heart hammered against his ribs. Was it a trick of the light? A shadow? His imagination? Then, something wet dripped onto his shoulder. Daniel swallowed hard and slowly tilted his head upward. High above, nestled in the twisted branches, were figures, several of them. Their bodies hung limply from the trees, faceless heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their fingers twitched, spasming in the air as if trying to grasp something unseen. And from the void where their eyes should have been, a thick, black substance oozed, dripping onto the forest floor. Then one of them moved. Its limbs cracked as it twisted toward him, faceless head snapping into place, as if noticing him for the first time. A grotesque, gurgling sound slithered from its throat, a noise that was neither human nor animal. The figures began to shift, their hanging bodies jerking as if they were waking up from a long slumber. Somewhere in the darkness, the whisper returned. Daniel ran. Chapter 2, The Warnings. The next morning, Daniel awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. His dream had been plagued with faceless figures, endless whispers, and the suffocating sense of being watched. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, he dressed and made his way to the town's only diner. As he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, he overheard an old man at the next table speaking in hushed tones. "They say if you see him once, he's marked you," the man said, voice grave. "The Faceless Man doesn't just disappear. He follows." Daniel's stomach twisted. He had never told anyone about what he saw the previous night, but somehow it felt like the old man was speaking directly to him. He leaned closer. "What happens if he follows you?" The man's eyes darkened. "You vanish. First, people start forgetting you. Friends don't return your calls. Family doesn't recognize your face. Then, one night, you just disappear." Daniel forced a laugh, trying to shake the chill creeping down his spine. "Come on, that's just an old ghost story." The old man shook his head. "Believe what you want. Just don't ignore the whispers." Daniel left the diner with his appetite ruined, but the old man's words clung to him like a curse. And that night, when he turned off his bedroom light, he heard the whisper again. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside his room. Chapter 3, The Vanishing. Days passed, and Daniel's world began to unravel. His co-workers at the bookstore gave him blank stares when he greeted them. His best friend, Aaron, ignored his texts. We called his mother. She paused before asking, "Who is this?" Panic gripped him as he ran to his bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back, unchanged. But were his features softer, his identity slipping? The whisper returned, louder now, filling his ears with an unbearable, shapeless noise. Then he saw the shadow in the mirror, standing behind him, the Faceless Man. His breath caught as the mirror image twisted. The reflection of the Faceless Man didn't just stand still. It moved, its head tilting in slow, jerky movements. Its long, bony fingers reached toward the glass, pressing against the surface as if trying to break through. Cracks spiderwebbed across the mirror. Daniel stumbled backward, heart pounding. The whisper became a chorus of voices, moaning, crying, laughing in distorted tones. His room darkened, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Then the lights flickered, and the Faceless Man stepped out of the mirror. His limbs bent at unnatural angles, his fingers elongating as he crawled toward Daniel. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, the voices shrieking in a language that scraped against Daniel's mind. A putrid stench filled the air, something like rotting meat and burnt hair. His vision blurred as hands, dozens of hands, reached out from the darkness, grasping at his clothes, his skin, pulling him towards something unseen. Chapter 4, The End. Daniel tried to fight it, to remind himself who he was, to hold onto his identity. But the more he struggled, the more the world seemed to forget him. His apartment became empty. His belongings vanished one by one. His name, his memories, his existence faded like mist in the morning sun. On the final night, he stood in front of his mirror, staring at the reflection that barely looked like him anymore. The Faceless Man stood beside him now, a towering presence of empty horror. The whisper turned into words. "Join us." Daniel opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His vision blurred as darkness consumed him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was his reflection changing, his face melting away into smooth, featureless skin. And then he was gone. The next morning, the apartment was abandoned. No one remembered Daniel Carter. No records of his existence remained. But if you walked through the woods of Black Hollow on a cold autumn night, you might see a figure standing just at the edge of your vision. Tall, thin, motionless, and faceless. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whisper. And if you do, it's already too late.